On a bright June morning in 1960, four teenagers went camping by a quiet Minnesota lake. By sunrise, three of them would be dead, brutally murdered inside their tent by an unknown attacker who vanished without a trace. For over 60 years, the Lake Morgan murders have remained one of America's most horrifying and baffling unsolved cases. This is their story. Before that tragic night at Lake Morgan, the victims were just ordinary teenagers enjoying the start of summer. Mary Ellen Bjork, often called Mary or sometimes just Ellie, was only 15 years old in the summer of 1960. In fact, she was just days away from her 16th birthday when she agreed to go on this camping trip. She lived in Bloomington, a suburb of Minneapolis, and by all accounts was a typical American teenage girl who enjoyed school breaks, spending time with friends, and looking forward to outdoor adventures. She was dating 18-year-old Neil Gustafson, and the two had planned this double-date camping trip with another young couple. The other couple consisted of Anna Mae Tucker, also 15 years old and Mary's close friend. The two girls were classmates and neighbors in Bloomington, and they decided to go camping together as a fun excursion to kick off the summer. Anna was dating the fourth member of their group, Stephen. Her father had initially been against the trip, but her mother was able to convince him to let her go. In June 1960, Minnesota's summer days were long and bright, a very enticing time for young teenagers like Anna to enjoy nature. With her good friend Mary and their boyfriends along, Anna anticipated a night of laughter and memories by the lakeside. Stephen Anthony Boise, 18 years old, was one of the two older boys in the group, also from Bloomington. Stephen was best friends with Neil Gustafson. The two young men had likely bonded over school classes, hobbies like motorcycles, and plans for the future. At 18, Stephen would have been either just finished with high school or about to head off to college, or perhaps even considering military service. Physically, Stephen was an able-bodied teen who worked as an apprentice electrician. As the older boyfriend, he might have felt responsible for the safety of the group during this trip. He rode his motorcycle with Anna on the back to the campsite, carrying gear and in high spirits for the night under the stars. Neil Gustafson, also 18 years old but slightly younger than Stephen, is the most complex figure in this story. At the time of the trip, Neil was an athletic, blonde teenager from Bloomington, known to be popular, outgoing, and fun-loving. He was Stephen's best friend and Mary's boyfriend. Like Stephen, Neil enjoyed riding motorcycles, and the two young men each used their bikes to ferry their girlfriends to Lake Morgan. By all appearances, Neil was just a normal teen excited for a camping adventure with his sweetheart and close friends. These four teenagers formed two couples in a tight-knit friend group. Everyone got along and looked forward to spending time together. In essence, this was a sweetheart's getaway for two young couples. The dynamic was likely typical of teenagers, joking around, a bit of flirting between the couples, and mutual trust. There was no indication before the trip of any serious tensions or conflicts among them. At least at the outset, all four seemed happy to be together. Little did they know that this camaraderie and youthful adventure would soon turn into a scene of unimaginable horror.
Saturday, June 4th, 1960, was the day the group set out for their camping excursion. The teenagers chose Lake Morgan, a scenic lake about 15 miles west of Minneapolis, as their destination. Lake Morgan, located near the town of Eden Prairie, was known to be a popular camping spot among locals, a place where campers could pitch a tent, swim, fish, and just enjoy nature. It was described as a large, tranquil lake surrounded by small towns and forests of oak and pine. In other words, an ideal setting for an overnight outing in the wilderness without being too far from home. The decision may have been spontaneous or planned in advance. Sources aren't clear on exactly who suggested it, but all four eagerly agreed. All of them being from the city of Bloomington, a relatively short distance away, made Lake Morgan an attractive and convenient spot for a quick getaway. The boys, Neil and Stephen, wanted to make use of their recently acquired motorcycles and were excited to take their girlfriends on a riding and camping adventure. With parental permission sorted as needed for the 15-year-old girls and their destination picked, the stage was set. The group packed light, as typical for overnight camping. They had a single tent large enough to accommodate all four of them, which emphasized the coziness of their plan, roughing it together under one canvas. They were all staying in one tent, and they likely brought sleeping bags, some food and treats, and other essentials. Because they were traveling by motorcycle, everything had to be very compact. Nothing is mentioned about them carrying any weapons or protection, like a hunting knife for camping. It appears they did not anticipate any danger from people or animals. It's worth noting that in early June in Minnesota, the summer days are incredibly long. At that northern latitude, sunset doesn't come until after 9 o'clock, and twilight lingers for hours afterward. The evenings have a beautiful, soft quality to them, with the sky glowing in shades of blue and purple long into what should be nighttime. This extended daylight was probably part of the appeal for the four teenagers, giving them more time to enjoy the outdoors and the magic of a Minnesota summer evening. Upon arrival, they would have seen a picturesque lake with beautiful natural surroundings. The area was known to have a small general store nearby that often catered to campers and hikers. It's not clear if the teens stopped at the store or interacted with locals upon arriving, but they proceeded to pick a spot for their tent. They chose a location along the shore, a flat clearing not far from the water. By all accounts, their arrival and setup went smoothly. Neil and Stephen likely helped each other assemble the tent, while Mary and Anna might have laid out sleeping bags and gathered firewood. With their camp established, the journey concluded and the leisure began. The daylight hours of June 4th passed uneventfully and pleasantly for the group by all accounts. The afternoon was likely spent in typical camping pastimes, possibly swimming in the lake's cool waters, lounging on the shore, and exploring the woods. According to later reports, nothing unusual happened during that day. The friends enjoyed each other's company and the freedom of being out in nature. The evening of June 4th gradually grew darker as the long summer twilight faded. At some point, the teens retired to their tent for the night. 4 people in one tent would have been a snug fit, and they likely arranged themselves with the couples next to each other. Based on diary evidence and witness accounts, the group did not venture away from their own campsite to socialize that night, at least not according to initial statements. As far as the teens were concerned that night, they were alone and secure in their campsite.
Allegedly, there was mention of the boys being drunk in Mary's diary. They would fall asleep and wake up around 2 in the morning, after which the boys got up for a bit, and the girls fell immediately back to sleep. Eventually, they were all asleep inside their tent. The night was calm, with the lake waters gently lapping and the dark sky above. It should have been a peaceful slumber in a beautiful place. However, as the early morning hours rolled around, an unknown terror crept toward the unsuspecting campers. At approximately 4 to 6 in the morning on June 5th, an unknown assailant launched a frenzied attack on the 4 sleeping teenagers. The evidence indicates that the killer struck from outside the tent, slashing and bludgeoning through the tent's fabric without ever entering it. In other words, the perpetrator used the tent itself as a barrier, blindly swinging at the victims through the canvas walls. The weapon was most likely a knife, possibly accompanied by a heavy blunt instrument. The attacks were extremely violent and swift, and the teenagers were caught completely off guard because they were sleeping. One can only imagine the confusion and terror inside that tent. The sounds of the canvas ripping, screams of pain, and the sudden realization that they were under attack. The tent itself quickly collapsed onto the occupants during the onslaught. Much later, witnesses would recall seeing the tent in a flattened state, as if it had imploded on itself. Investigators believe the assailant first cut the tent's guidelines or supports, perhaps to trap the victims inside, and then struck downward through the material. All 4 teenagers were injured in this gruesome attack, and 3 would not survive. Despite the viciousness of the assault, none of the victims managed to escape or fully fend off the assailant. There are no reports of any of the teens getting out of the tent to run or fight, indicating how sudden and overwhelming the ambush was. The assault likely lasted only minutes, but was absolutely devastating. Inside that tent, the screams had stopped, the slashing had stopped, the terror had reached its crescendo, and then silence. The canvas lay collapsed and torn, stained with the blood of 4 teenagers who had only wanted a summer adventure. 3 of them would never see another sunrise. 1 would somehow survive, though barely, clinging to life by a thread. And then, as quickly as the nightmare had begun, it was over. The killer vanished into the early morning mist, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The weapon still dripping, the tent shredded and collapsed. 4 young bodies, some still, some barely breathing. The tranquil waters of Lake Morgan lapped peacefully at the shore, indifferent to the carnage that had just unfolded mere feet away. As the sun began to rise over the Minnesota landscape, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, the campsite remained silent. No one knew yet what had happened. No one had heard the screams over the distance. The motorcycles sat parked where the boys had left them the day before, waiting for riders who would never return. The Lake Morgan murders had just become Minnesota's most horrifying unsolved mystery. But in those early morning hours of June 5, 1960, as the killer disappeared into the woods and the victims lay bleeding by the water's edge, the story was only beginning. What happened next would shock a community, baffle investigators for decades, and leave more questions than answers. The discovery of the campsite, the frantic investigation, and the shocking twist that no one saw coming, that's a story for another time.